Greetings. Welcome to discussion 6 of Deeper Questions and our final session for the semester. This is our grand finale. It's the second part of our unit on miracles and really brings together everything we've done so far comes together today. In some respect or another, every topic or subtopic we've addressed thus far comes into focus. And it's also the most sensitive material that we'll have discussed up to this point. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's the most sensitive material pretty much period that you could talk about. So we will approach that respectfully and carefully. I wanted to just start, even before we go to the group exercise. I'll lower the shades a little bit to give us a little bit less glare on the screen. Would anyone be interested in giving a quick overview of the letter to Galatia overall? I know I didn't assign the entire thing, but it is an important text. And we don't need to know the whole thing, but it's just if anyone was interested in kind of laying out their position on what the thing is overall, I'd be happy to let someone do that at this point if there was any interest in that. No? All right. We'll go directly into the section that we'll be focusing on, and then I'll have a brief comment on what the remainder of it is. Any thoughts on it before? I'm going to play the audio of it. Are there any thoughts before we proceed? We're good? All right. And so here's our latest professional reader to spare you the sound of my voice once again. Let me try this.
The New American Standard Bible, copyright by the Luckman Foundation. Galatians chapter 1. Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, so that he might rescue us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forevermore. Amen. I am amazed that you were so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God? Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure, and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, But I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now in what I am writing to you, I assure you before God that I am not lying. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea, which were in Christ. But only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy. And they were glorifying God because of me. Chapter 2. Then, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running, or had run, in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. But from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised, effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I also was eager to do. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew...
All right, and then it goes on. And that goes on from there. What would you? Well, actually, let me do the background on the text first, and then we'll go into the overview of the argument. So, as I said, this is turning to our all-powerful page 27 table, which I said that the workshop was going to govern the scope of what I would be prepared to cover and state as fact from here for the purposes of triggering conversation. This document, which is labeled here as Galatians, or Paul's letter to Galatia, has, of the 6 categories of potential areas of textual dispute, it has none of them. And so as a result, it is a highly it's a well-preserved specimen, one of the best, of the early movement that would become Christianity. And so that means, to return us back to discussions 2 and 3, that a lot of those issues that we had to face, a lot of the ambiguities that came, especially with our discussion of the letter to the elder, the letter of the elder to Gaius, which we have since learned is traditionally labeled 3 John, a lot of those issues we won't be facing. So notice then in some respects the conversation is going to go easier than that conversation. And it's one of the rare, if you look overall at this, there's very few that have no issue, and there are some have relatively minor issues, but again, this text is a particularly well-preserved specimen. And so it is therefore real for our purposes, which is a big deal to say. We in the past have never been able to even get to that point. We've been just stuck in various sorts of authentication analyses and haven't moved beyond that. So what we're looking at is real, and is also in one sense of the word true. It is what it is. And its genre is also not in dispute here. This is a letter. It's not a fiction. It's not a piece of fiction that contains a letter. It's an actual letter. So I want to put that in perspective. In terms of date, this is returning us to our fun timeline that we laid out in discussion 3, where we have here bracketing the crucifixion in circa 30 CE, and then today, which for those who don't know is 2012 CE. And we have, just to go over rather quickly, there we have our discussion 2 group exercise. We have our discussion 3 group exercise, and then we have here the 39th Festal letter, which from circa 367 CE, which is of course the first time in which an individual said that the 27 texts that are in what we call the New Testament ought to be canonized, not to be the only text that ought to be canonized, which had great significance for our discussion 3 topic. And so that's where we were at discussion 3. Here's where we are now. Oh, whoops, went the wrong direction. Here's where we are now. We've now inserted this. This is our group 6 discussion group exercise. And notice a couple things. First, the date range is a lot narrower. It's just I'm assigning a 10-year date range that this was written somewhere between 50 and 60 CE. And that's on the wider side. The scholars that take positions on the date will tend to be more specific. It's that one will argue for between 53 and 54, say, and they'll argue between 55 and 56, say. So that's the cumulative, more or less, of the bulk of that. But some people will be prepared to go quite a bit more specific. Notice we've never, other than the Festal letter, notice we've never been able to say anything remotely like that up until this point. So that's the background on the text itself. Let's stay here for a moment. What would someone say is the basic argument that's being made in this section of the document? Well, let me...
Is he talking basically about... He's writing this letter to the church, and he's talking about how quickly they've forsaken Jesus. Am I right about that? Sort of.
Yeah, that's essentially his. Yeah,
and he's kind of professing the truth to what he saw.
Yeah.
Kind of like what we talked about last time with the followers. So.
Other thoughts on that?
I was just going to say I have kind of a hard time picking out the...
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there, yeah.
What wants to say.
Yeah. Ryan's speaking to the overall point of the letter, and I'll just say rather quickly, this document starts with this, and then it goes into, well, he yells at Peter. And then he proceeds from there into, the narrative stops at that point, and he does not return to narrative for the rest of the text. The remainder, this is essentially the introduction we're looking at. The remainder is his argument, and the argument is essentially he's taking a position on what the relationship is between this new movement and Mosaic law. And that doesn't really matter a whole lot for our purposes, but that is his thesis throughout the remainder of it is that. And there are two issues, there are two pieces of Mosaic law, and again, this doesn't directly bear on what we're talking about, but it's worth at least mentioning before we proceed. There are two pieces of Mosaic law he's focusing on here. Well, sort of one and then maybe a corollary of it. And that's... Anyone?
What a Mosaic law, is that...
Mosaic law is Jewish law.
That's kind of what okay.
That mainly appears in the first few books, in the books that we label Leviticus,
Gotcha.
Exodus a little bit, Numbers a little bit.
Well, if I remember correctly, because he talks about like the sacrifices and the things that they made, and that the coming of Christ fulfilled the Mosaic law according to their teachings. And so, I mean, the Jews were kind of holding on to the old Jewish traditions, but the Gentiles being baptized into the church, they didn't have those same traditions. And so Paul is saying, it's okay. I mean, you don't have to be circumcised, but you just follow Christ, and that's what I think that's the gist of what he's saying.
And that's you said the operative word right there. It's circumcision is one of the main issues here. The question is, to be a member of this movement, do you have to be circumcised? And his position is a very emphatic no. At least for non-ethnic Jews. And then there's a little bit of some dietary issues, and we may touch on that if we get into it. So that's his overall argument. The introduction to that argument that we've just read through serves what function in his argument?
You're referring to the first page.
The whole this whole section. Why does he, given that he is making this argument, why does he start off? Why did he start off with this introduction? And by introduction, I pretty much mean the totality of the excerpt we looked at.
I guess just to establish the credibility of the rest of his argument, just to say that this is, if you hear otherwise, then that's not true. What I'm saying should be taken as true. Is that?
That's essentially it. Yeah,
Okay.
he is arguing for his authority to make the argument that he then goes on to make. And what is the claim of authority he's making about himself? And now we zero in on the topic for today. This is the miracle. What is the claim that he's making about himself?
That he saw the resurrected Lord.
Yeah. Exactly. And more than that, it goes beyond that as well. It's that plus it's that plus something else.
And the revelation that he
It's or the fact that he was set aside in the womb, or is that what you mean? Or
well, is he the only person with this authority? No. But what? Well, let me ask this: what is in dispute here? Is the resurrection in dispute here? No. Which is, for our purposes, that's that's why we're going to be looking at this. But that's not the point of this argument. What the resurrection's not in dispute, but what is?
Gospel?
Yes. How to interpret the significance of the resurrection is in dispute, but also the event that's in dispute. It's his own revelation. It's the appearance. It's the resurrection appearance to him specifically. In this text, it's taken as a given that these other people had the same experience. That's a given. What's in dispute is whether he had it himself, because this section ends with he's fighting with who?
Peter.
Right. He's fighting with Peter. So all of this is leading up to him saying, I have standing on par with Peter, and plus I'm right. So I am correct, and he is wrong, and I have had an apostolic calling, and so I have full standing to do this. And so what this is going to be, and now we're going to walk through it, is his argument for why for the evidence he's laying out, his case for the evidence for why his personal resurrection appearance is true. Now, for our purposes, we're not quite as interested in that. We are what people talk about and discuss today is more whether any of them were true. But in this context, he's laying out the evidence for this one. And so we're going to go through that. And basically, there's this chronology here. And so I have our fun. This is our fun map. This is the Eastern Mediterranean right here. I chose a map that has contemporary national borders, so hopefully that'll give you some context in terms of a little bit of where things are. So let's get a couple things down here on the map before we proceed. Where is the center? Well, before I proceed, the word apostle means what? We've come across this word already.
A witness.
Yes, that's essentially. An apostle is going to be someone who claims to have seen Jesus alive after he was dead, plus was called to a leadership position as a result. So, and we have these various people who are laying claim to apostolic status in the course of this document. And each of them are claiming a miracle unto themselves. And we're focusing on Paul's, but we have this sort of this is part of this broader collection of reported miracles that's going on. So to put some stuff on the map, where's the center of apostolic activity here in this letter? In terms of where all of the...
Jerusalem.
Yes, Jerusalem. So we put Jerusalem up here on the map. This is where it seems that most apostles, most of the time in the course of this narrative that he's giving, is in Jerusalem. Where does this narrative start? This is kind of, if we don't get it right away, we'll get it a little bit farther down the road.
The road to Damascus, right? Because he talks about how he was going to Damascus and then he saw the vision.
I'm going to stipulate for the moment, and we'll see why in a minute, I'm going to stipulate that this starts in Damascus. So here we are. So it starts off, the letter begins, and right off the bat you see his thesis for the authority portion of his argument. He says that he is an apostle, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead. So that's your full apostolic claim right there. He was never appointed by a man. He was appointed directly through the revelation. he then proceeds into sort of a summary of his argument, and he makes this point, which some people referenced last time, where he talks about the angel. And what specifically, this is at the bottom of the 4th paragraph, well, including the little tiny second paragraph, the fourth paragraph. What does he say about angels? So the second to final sentence there.
Where but even we.
Yeah. He's saying that the message that he has received through his calling is so correct that if an angel says something different to you, ignore the angel. It's a very powerful statement that he's making about his own authority. And what does he say about himself? Or himself in the plural, him and his associates there. It says, but even if we, or an angel from heaven. So if an angel appears to you and says differently from what my position is, ignore it. If I change my own mind, ignore me at that point. So he's going out there in terms of the claim he's making. He then reiterates again that this is not from man, this is from God. He says, the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man, for I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And so now that we're on the map here, what does that significance? What's the significance for the map of his point right there?
So he wasn't in Jerusalem.
Right.
When he received the.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the big. That right there. That's the argument.
Okay.
Right there. You can almost pack it up and go home. I mean that is his point. This whole thing is about the fact that he was in physical quarantine from the others when he received this information. So, and then he goes on to. Now he goes on into, this is at the top of page 33. He then begins the narrative itself. And it starts off with him doing what? It says, I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. So, now we don't know, he doesn't say, that's not very specific in terms of exactly what he was doing, but he was a critic of this movement in its very earliest little period of time, and was very active in pushing against it in one way or another.
It was basically, wasn't he saying he's just I was a really good Jew, basically, kind of at the beginning too?
And he also goes into this discussion about his advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries, and we'd have to kind of look in a little bit into what exactly he probably means by that. But he is saying I was orthodox, lowercase o, orthodox in my views at the time. And so in that context, I was fighting against this other movement.
I just have a question. So I can get bearings a little bit more.
Sure.
Did he know Jesus when Jesus was alive? Or
There's
not?
no record to indicate.
Okay, I was like, the apostles, he's claiming to be an apostle.
Right.
Correct? And just flesh this out. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Background on this. The 12 apostles that sat with Jesus at the Last Supper, is that?
Yeah.
And he was not one of them.
No.
Okay.
There are 12. There's a distinction between an apostle and a disciple.
Okay.
And there's some evidence, there's debate over this, that Jesus had this a selected group of 12 individuals who were his entourage in his own public career.
Okay.
And Paul's not one of those.
Because those were disciples, not apostles.
Right.
Okay. Good.
And so part of the big deal of what he is saying here is that you can be an apostle and not be a disciple.
Okay. That's
No,
That
helps.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No. There's a lot. There's a lot here. So then it says and notice that it's a little interesting for purposes that we may get to discuss later. The event, the miracle, is touched on very, very briefly. All he says here is, so he had his views, he was trying to destroy the church of God, and then he just says, but God, ellipsis, was pleased to reveal his Son to me. And that's all. Now we'll just take that sort of as an X at this. It's sort of this. He had an experience. He doesn't really talk about it at all here. It just says, God was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I may preach him among the Gentiles. And we'll talk. I think some people will be interested in trying to figure out exactly what he's talking about when he says that. And we'll get into that. But what does he do next?
He said he went away to Arabia.
Right. He went to Arabia.
And then came back to Damascus.
Right. And that's where I got the Damascus. He comes back to Damascus. So that's when I stipulated he's starting off in Damascus. That's the extent of my evidence for having done so right there, in terms at least of this document. But he also says, I mean, he went to Arabia, but he also says something else right before that.
Like he didn't go to Jerusalem.
Right.
He went to Arabia instead, so it's not like he could have learned about it from going there.
Right. So he says, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. Again, he's saying I am not deputized by man. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went to Arabia. Now, Arabia, the scholarship I've looked at has basically said this word is, it's a somewhat ambiguous word. It's not the way we use the word today, which would be most likely the Arabian Peninsula. It is probably this area, sort of roughly over here, in east of the Jordan River. It's a region, and he doesn't say anything more specifically than that. So here we have his first movement right there. He goes out here, and then he returns back to Damascus. So we have that movement there. Then what happens? His next movement is what?
He went to Jerusalem.
Right. And after how much time?
3 years later.
Right. So he stays in Damascus for 3 years, and then he goes to Jerusalem. So now he's there for the first time. This is for shorthand, for the sake of this, we'll call his first Jerusalem trip. And what does he do there?
Stays with Peter for 15 days.
Yeah. And furthermore, that's his purpose for going. As he says he went to become acquainted with Peter. And by the Cephas is who? Peter. It's just two. He goes back and forth. He's using two different language versions of the name Peter. So Cephas is just another name for.
Word, and Peter is the Greek.
Or vice versa.
Peter is Petros in Greek for stone, and then Cephas is because the high priest was Caiaphas, and then it's the same root, I believe.
Oh.
So it's the same name, it's just the Aramaic or the Hebrew and the Greek.
Right.
That makes sense.
So he goes to be with Peter, and he stays with him for 15 days. And what else does he do while he's there? What does he not do?
He didn't see any of the other apostles except James.
Right. He said, and notice how he stops, and notice how emphatically he reiterates this. He says, while I was there, I saw no one else but James. Now, in what I am writing to you, I assure you before God that I am not lying. What does that sound like? Is that...
Last week?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's remarkably identical. It's remarkably similar to the closing sentence of the testimony of the 8. It says, "And we lie not, God bearing witness of it." So it's an interesting parallel. It brings back some of that discussion that we had about that need to reaffirm before those to whom you're testifying. So it's just an interesting parallel there. And who is James?
The Lord's brother. No.
Is he another apostle?
Yes, but Paul's calling him an apostle. Now this translator, well, let me pause. There's this big dispute over whether James and Jesus were brothers or cousins. And it's a fairly bitter dispute for certain reasons. Now, I'm just going to call them kinsmen because for these purposes, it doesn't really matter. But they were close relatives. And so Paul's recognizing him as a kinsman. This translator feels that the word is sufficiently clear to say that Paul thinks that they were brothers. And he furthermore calls him an apostle. Then what happens? So we have this 15-day trip to Jerusalem, and then what happens after that?
Syria and Sicilia.
Right. And that is these regions up here. These are regions of the Roman Empire, Cilicia and Syria, that are both they're fairly general areas. He does not say specifically where he is in there. He may have traveled around in there. But he basically goes up here. And he does what? Or how long is he there?
14 years.
Yeah. He's there for 14 years. And then what happens?
Went back to Jerusalem.
Right. And why did he go?
Came back with Barnabas.
Yeah.
Revelation.
Yeah, he has another revelation. And I talk a little, some in the materials, exactly how many revelations is Paul claiming he's had over the course of his life. Here he seems to be saying at least he's citing 2 distinct ones. So I had a little discussion of there exactly how frequent was this phenomenon and so forth. Yeah.
Even though he was there for 14 years, he wrote letters to this whole region during his ministry up there. So I mean, he's not just isolated; he's writing letters back and forth with the apostles and with the members of the church in that whole region.
But you would say that's later, right?
Yeah.
Or at least the bulk. The bulk of it.
The bulk of them are later, but I'm sure even during this time, I mean, we don't have all of them,
right?
Obviously, but I'm sure that he had communication with the church,
right,
during his ministry.
Yeah, he is. He's doing some evangelism, presumably during this time. We may go back to that. What distinctions between this earlier portion of his career and then the later portion of his career. So he goes back to Jerusalem, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens. He brings his friend Titus. There's some discussion about snip snip for Titus, and because the circumcision issue is not the center of the point for today, we'll gloss over the bulk of that paragraph. But if we were looking at the underlying theological thesis of the letter, we'd spend a chunk of time there. And what happened? But at the end, this is at the tail end of the second to last paragraph, the big one. What's the outcome of that trip? Actually, sorry, let me just pull out one line from that section we're skipping over. He mentions, he says, that he goes because of a vision, but he then says, upon his arrival with the apostles, I submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, which is all this activity he's been doing for the last 17 years. But I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. And by running, he means, so it's a metaphor for pursuing the work he's doing. So he wants to verify, and this is sort of the second part of the argument. Mark got the first. He was not in Jerusalem, but then what happens now? And this is at the very tail end of that larger paragraph. Well, who are the other players here? Yeah. Peter, James, and John. Barnabas, an associate of Paul's, is also in the room. And what do the five of them do?
Give him the right hand of fellowship.
Yeah. The three, Peter, James, and John, give Paul and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. So Paul is claiming, says, I was out here in isolation. I come in, and our stories match. Who are? Well, actually, let's pause for a moment here. This brings us back to several discussions we've had so far, where we've had this figure, John, son of Zebedee, who's been, I intended to be sort of the Where's Waldo figure of this semester, because he sort of has, I've somewhat by chance, but somewhat by my design, he has been popping up in kind of interesting places throughout the semester. And we saw in discussion 2, he played this very vague role that we talked about, the Johannine texts. He was sort of floating around in the background, not really attached to anything that we were actually talking about, but there. We saw in discussion 3, he plays this powerful metaphysical role where he brings together the apostles and the disciples, and they comprise this document that the author of the Muratorian canon is recognizing. Today we meet him for the first time directly. This is the most undisputed, clear-cut reference to him anywhere. And he is a man he was an associate of Jesus's, he's a follower of Jesus's. There's most of what's believed about him is in dispute, so I can't address it, but the bare bones is he is someone who knew Jesus. Jesus seems to have had a relationship with the Zebedee family, and he was at this meeting. That's essentially your core activity right there. And he may, and it's a bit more speculative. I talk in the materials. He may have had a brother, incidentally, who was also named James, who was killed in the years running up to this meeting. Martyred. So we have so we have John, son of Zebedee, presumably John, son of Zebedee. In every early text where Jesus is associated with someone named John, it's John, son of Zebedee. So it's a reasonable inference to infer that that's the person here. We have Peter, another associate of Jesus, and then we have James, his kinsman. So these are all people who knew Jesus well. And Paul comes on to the scene, and his claim is coming out of this meeting that they thought I was an equal. And then they go off and they divvy up this where the evangelism is going to go, and Paul's going to go to the Gentiles, and Peter's going to go to the Jews, and that's more or less beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But they have this. Paul says we have this plan. We have the right hand to fellowship. We are united as apostles. Yeah.
I guess it's just a little surprising that I guess he didn't have any prior contact with James, Peter, and John. Is this saying he didn't know them before he went and met them here on this occasion with Barnabas?
Well,
or had they been in contact before that?
Well, he stayed with Peter in Jerusalem.
Okay.
14 years ago.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah, so it seems like the whole purpose of him going back, having discussed that first trip, is to answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
He is sort of conceding for the record he's conceding for the record every contact he's had with them up until this point, or at least what he's prepared to be honest about in this letter. Is that?
Yeah.
And he from what he says, he had never met John, son of Zebedee, up until this point. At least that seems to be the inference of what he's claiming in the letter. So then that's pretty much it. That's your miracle pattern. It goes on from here, and we'll just briefly touch on this. It goes on to this next episode, and where are we in the next phase of this?
Where he's arguing with Peter.
Yeah. It's just the portion of the final paragraph.
Gotcha.
They're in Antioch, and let me pull that up. Antioch is up here, right there, in the top northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. So now they're over there, and then that's when this happens. And we don't have to go into this section a whole lot, but what are some important takeaways from that incident?
Peter wouldn't associate with the Gentiles?
Yeah, that's the accusation. Well, how's the right hand of fellowship going?
Looks like it's going so good. Point.
Yeah, and Paul's claim here, and we'd have to go back. He'd been building up in this larger paragraph, the stuff we skipped over. He'd been building up some other stuff that's now combining in this paragraph. I'm just going to sort of speculate here. There are people that study the raw theology of this more, and I'm certainly no theologian, but it appears to be that that there's some people are eating together in this community, and there may be some sort of dispute about whether people need to be together when they're eating or separated when they're eating. that may be, this is just speculation on my part, it may be that what's happening is that Paul comes away from the Right Hand of Fellowship meeting saying, okay, I thought we were all in the same boat, that circumcision is not a requirement. Hence when he says, and Titus was there and they didn't have any problem with Titus at the time, and he was uncircumcised. Right. But it may be that what Peter is doing is when Paul and Peter then are in Antioch, Peter's may be taking more of a compromise position where he's saying maybe, okay, it's okay for there to be circumcised and uncircumcised, but maybe for ritual purity reasons while we're eating, people just need to be separate. That might be what's going on. And Paul's reaction to that is what?
He doesn't like it.
Yeah, he's very, whatever it is, he is very mad about it. And then the whole remainder of the letter is that.
What is the significance of the circumcision? Like, I'm not
Is it dirty
too
versus
keen on.
clean?
Is it?
I kind of.
Why is there such a rift?
Yeah, circumcision at this time in Judaism was an important I want to be careful about that. Yeah.
It was something that you had to do, and it was like a covenant that you made with God on behalf of the child. And so, it was a very serious thing for the Jews to be circumcised because they had to.
Yeah.
And so for Gentiles where that wasn't a part of their culture, they learn about Jesus and get excited and they get baptized, they're not circumcised. And so the Jews who had grown up in that culture kind of look at them and be like, oh, hey,
Yeah. So
what's going on here, and you missed a step, And so Paul is saying that, and in a verse a little bit later that I think is important for this discussion, at 16 it says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So he's saying that it's faith in Christ that leads you to salvation, not strictly adhering to the Mosaic law.
Okay. So they just think that the non-circumcised are not as good of believers, essentially.
Kind of, yeah. I think that's a fair summation of it.
Okay.
Circumcision, maybe with some exceptions, but the mainstream of Judaism at this point would more or less be saying circumcision is a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And so as this new movement arises within it, then there's this dispute about whether that carries over into the new movement. And
I think this whole discussion goes back to in Acts where Peter had that vision where the sheep came down and it had the unclean animals on it. He was told to eat. And then, forget the centurion's name. Was it? There was a Gentile who had a dream that Christ was the Lord. He wanted to be baptized. And so the Lord told Peter through that experience that, because at the time they were only preaching to the Jews. They weren't taking it everywhere. And so through that dream, the Lord told Peter, okay, now go preach to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the beginning, a lot of the converts to the church from the Gentiles, they converted first to Judaism, were circumcised, and then they converted to Christianity through baptism. And so it went that way for a while.
Okay.
And then with Paul, they started coming directly from Gentiles and being baptized into the church without going through Judaism.
Okay. Sorry to...
Oh, no, this is good. This is good.
Yeah,
this is good.
I didn't have the background prepared a little more.
This is good.
Okay.
These are all the right questions. Now we have reached though an important moment in the conversation, which I wasn't sure if we would get there or not, but we have gotten there. Where AJ has raised an additional text. Do you want to talk about that a little bit and why you selected that?
Well, I think that kind of goes to, that's connected to this issue that we were talking about with the gospel going to the Gentiles, that, at the end of the Gospels, Christ told his apostles, go everywhere and teach everybody, baptize everybody, but apparently they didn't understand that because in Acts, which was written by the same person that wrote the Gospel of Luke, presumably, Peter had that dream that said, okay, now go out and preach the gospel to everybody. So I think that kind of fits in with the theme of miracles and revelation, that in these texts in the New Testament we have many experiences of the Lord speaking to his apostles and his disciples on the earth to guide the church. And so, did that kind of answer your question? Is that what you were looking for?
So sort of. I've pulled up. I pulled us back to the table here. What would you say? Your choice of the Acts of the Apostles for this is what?
That's where the experience is recorded.
Okay. If the text we're talking when we refer to Acts, there are many Acts. It was a genre of writing that was somewhat prevalent. It's essentially an Acts is essentially a gospel, but in the sense of it's a narrative account, but of someone other than Jesus. Often an apostle. There's the Acts of Paul and Fayetteville, the Acts of Thomas. There are a lot of Acts. The most famous one is the Acts of the Apostles, or what we label the Acts of the Apostles. Here's the dispute pattern for it. It has a traditional the traditional attribution is disputed, notice it follows the exact same pattern as 3 John. So for those who are here for the 3 John discussion, some of those issues we ran into, if we were to look at the Acts of the Apostles, would be the same. It also has, which isn't in this, there's a dispute about, essentially its genre, and associated with that its accuracy. And so because of that, I can't take a position on that. I mean, you guys certainly can, and AJ's essentially saying you're prepared to go forward with using it. Yeah. And so I can't say anything on that one way or the other. But that's the context. That's the context in which you're.
Is it
yes.
accuracy of what the accuracy of what?
The accuracy.
What was actually said to what was actually written?
Yes.
Or
essentially, yes. The text. It is a text for the. Well, are people familiar with it? Should I give a quick? Do you want to give a quick overview, just sort of what its scope is and what it talks about?
Of the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah.
Essentially, it picks up where Luke finishes. Because the writer talks about the life of Christ, and then with the Acts of the Apostles, it begins on the day of Pentecost, and when their apostles are meeting together, and they choose a new member of the 12 with them, and then it chronicles the travelings and the experiences that Peter and James and John and then later Paul have throughout, and Stephen, which was another missionary, if you will. And so it just kind of describes the early church through the life of up until the end of the life of Paul. So it just kind of gives a history of what the church did during that time. It contains some of the preachings and the sermons that some of the apostles gave during that time.
Are there any other thoughts on on that description?
Makes sense.
All right. I think, AJ, I think you're running a bit of a freebie here, but that's good. You earned it. Yeah, no, you definitely earned it. You put that forward pretty well. It is a text that has descriptions, these various accounts of events stretching about from 30 to 60 CE, and the range of views on it are from AJ's perspective all the way over to that it's basically not worth the paper it's written on in terms of evidentiary and historical value. So there's quite a bit of views in between the two.
Was it written? This may be a question. Was it written by the same person?
I think I was wondering who wrote. Was it written by all
Well,
apostles?
I had been taught that it was the Acts of the Apostles was written by the same person that wrote Luke, the Gospel of Luke. That it, if you look at,
Yes, and that's AJ's unfairly. I mean, I can more or less sign off on that fairly confidently that the Gospel 3 and the Acts of the Apostles are closely intertwined texts, probably with the same author.
Because if you look at the first verse of each book, like from the first chapter, it has kind of the same introduction or something like that, or maybe not.
Yeah.
I forget where it's at, but it's like written to the same person. Like if
So do we know who this person is, or is it just like the author?
AJ, do you want to take that one first?
Because I was trying to remember, like, I seem to think that it was like his name wasn't Luke for some reason, but that doesn't seem to make sense. But I don't remember exactly about that. Let me see if I can find it.
If we look to the text that's labeled Luke here on the chart, the only difference in the pattern between the two is that one is category 4, which doesn't, the interrelationship issue, which doesn't really matter for our purposes. They both have a traditional attribution issue, and that, for our friends from the workshop, that means what? It means that it's an anonymous text that is, over time, has come to be labeled. It's not the title of the text. None of these are the titles of the text. Most of these are letters that didn't have titles. But there's a traditional attribution of an author to the text, even though the text is itself anonymous.
Okay.
If there's an X,
pseudepigrapha, is that what that's called? Or is that?
That's category 5. That's where there is a stated author.
Oh, but they're not sure if that's.
But there's a dispute over whether that is in fact true, or if it is pseudepigraphy, then it isn't not true. But so an X means that there is a traditional attribution. And it's disputed. Some people believe that traditional attribution is correct. Some people believe it's not. The traditional attribution in this case is to this individual named Luke, or Lucas, if we want to be more proper to the Roman, and who is. There's probably nothing I can say about him that wouldn't be controversial. At the most, he's not someone who's very well known. He is mentioned.
Was he a disciple of Jesus?
What I have here,
No.
that it says that Luke wrote the Gospel of Acts, the third Gospel and the book of the Acts. That apparently he may have been like a traveler with Paul. That he went with Paul to a lot of these places. Was a Gentile. Like not much is known about him.
I'll give you the one thing that I'm permitting myself to say on this. If you look to Philemon, which is over here in the second column, that's a short personal letter. It's a really interesting letter. We talked about it a little bit in the second discussion. It's a personal, private letter that Paul wrote to two of his friends. And notice it has no dispute pattern, so I can go into here. He says at the end, he signs off and he sends greetings from several people, including someone named Luke, who he refers to as my fellow workers.
Okay.
So he is the traditional attribution is stemming off of that and some other things in some bit more disputed territory. But he is a fellow worker of Paul's.
Okay, gotcha.
So I know that's a long answer, but as we discussed especially in discussion 4, it's when there are arguments, when there's disagreement, it's all won and lost at this phase of the conversation where you're getting your where you're getting the credibility of your texts lined up. Right, I know there are a lot of prospective lawyers in the room as things are properly admitted into evidence.
Right.
So it's a long process. So it's appropriate that we take these long pauses. And so anyway, that's what I wanted to make sure that AJ had the opportunity to kind of walk through his case for citing the Acts of the Apostles. Any other discussion on that? I was wondering if we would go in that direction or not. So I'm glad that we did. All right. So I forget where were we? I think yeah. So. Oh, that's right. We were wrapping up with the Antioch thing. That's right. Let me. Let me just, for historical purposes, notice I've just added up to the top there. That's the region of Galatia. Galatia is not a place; it's a region. So this letter, Paul wrote this letter to some place in this area. That's where it is. And I'm putting up on the board Ephesus, which is way over here. And this is outside of the realm of consensus. Some people argue that this is where Paul was when he wrote this letter. There's another theory that would put him even farther west into Greece and Macedonia and that area. So that's we have our full map up there now. And notice for anyone who had the impression that Paul was a traveler, you'd be correct. This is a man who traveled very extensively, and it's clear from some other stuff in his surviving writings that he's not just going from one. I mean, he moved around a lot in the later portion of his career, which is why it doesn't say so when he says he went to Cilicia and Syria for 14 years. But given his later, if he had his later pattern, then he would have been bouncing around a fair amount in that area during those 14 years. All right, so that was good. What do people think? What do people think about the claim that he's making?
Which claim in particular? All of it.
The occurrence of when it goes back to this brief that kind of spins all of this off, says God was pleased to reveal His Son to me, or in me. God was pleased to reveal His Son in me. That basic claim, but then out of which all this other stuff is built. What do people think about that? With this geographic argument that he has laid out.
I mean, it's a pretty incredible claim. No matter where he was on the map when it happened, or where he had been, just to state with sincerity, that he
Saw a dead person?
saw Jesus Christ, and that he was given information by him, and that he was a pretty hard, committed Jew. That's not just anybody says that, so you gotta give him some deference for, I don't know, just stepping up to the plate and saying it, because you really have to have some sort of conviction to make a claim like that. It's just kind of my initial.
Other thoughts?
I believe it.
Right.
Cool. We have one right there. That's very good. Focusing in on what, Mark, you were talking about, the change in his views that's associated with whatever. What do we make of that?
I don't know. I'm not 100% certain on the size of was it considered Christianity at this point? Was there an official title for the movement?
Some historians will refer to this period as the Jesus movement. Others will call it Christianity. It is in the process what a sociologist of religion would call a religion. It's moving in that direction of solidifying in that way at this point, but it's either there in an early stage.
Okay.
You can go. People go either way in terms of how they describe it.
Yeah. Just as far as the scope of Christianity, I mean, I'm not sure how large it had grown at the time of his revelation, but I'm just guessing that it wasn't huge at this point, and for someone to be a strong supporter of Judaism and then to kind of, to make that change is tough, and that'd be a tough change to make. It's not one that you think somebody would just wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, I feel like claiming that I've seen, Jesus Christ when I've been a zealous Jew my whole life." So that's, I'll give him some credit there as far as, believability.
It's kind of like what we talked about last time, too. Just how much flack they must have taken and did take, especially in that time when you could be killed very easily for what you thought. So.
Yeah, and if I can cite the Acts of the Apostles again, I mean, there's a passage in there where Stephen was being stoned because he was preaching about Jesus, and Paul, he was called Saul, and was holding the robes of the priests who were throwing the rocks. And he saw firsthand people being killed for this belief, and just like you said, for him to go from that to being an ardent supporter of it is remarkable.
So Paul saw the stoning?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's even more incredible, just as far as taking a position. You gotta give him some credit for that.
Other thoughts?
And then I just the amount of time he devotes to his missionary work or his spread of the gospel. That's, somebody might think it was a good idea to claim to be an apostle of this religion and think that, maybe I'll accrue some sort of following and gain some sort of status and hopefully not be killed, like AJ said, the countervailing. But, they might think this is fun and it's something I should try out for a while. But to do it for such an extended period of time, makes you think that maybe he had a good reason for doing this.
Especially if he did it in that many regions.
Yeah, there you
You know,
go.
I mean, like if he was traveling to that many areas, which that's a lot of miles back then.
That is.
It's a lot of miles now.
Wow, that's a
A big commitment. Yeah. A big commitment to take on if you didn't believe that you experienced something.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, just doing it for fun. It kind of makes you think that maybe he was convinced that what he saw was real, and maybe that did happen. So it's impressive.
Anything else on that point? Those are all really good comments. Let's turn. Yeah.
Is it even would it have been possible to do that much? Because he was going back and forth between a lot of those two.
That's a good question.
Have you said possible?
He wrote in one of. There are a few. The core of what we know about Paul comes from seven undisputed texts of his, and some would throw on a few more, and some would throw on Acts of the Apostles and so forth. But at least coming from the basic seven, one of them is his letter to Rome, where he's talking about he wants to go to Spain. He's somewhere wet at this point where he's writing. He's east of Rome, and he's saying, "I want to come out there. I want to visit you guys. Then I'm headed out. I want to go to Spain after that." Now that's so he was a man. We don't know whether he accomplished that or not. There's no record of that. But he's gearing. I mean, this is local stuff compared to some of the traveling aspirations he actually had, which is so he
I think a lot
got
of it
his frequent flyer miles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of it was on foot though too, if I'm correct. I mean, riding donkey or whatever that time. Maybe.
Yeah.
When his trip to Rome, he was by boat, according to the Acts. But,
Yeah.
so,
There's some, and I think actually that's. Can I corroborate that from the Undisputed? I think in the Corinthian correspondence he says he did some traveling by sea as well.
So it's not all walking. So
Yeah, that makes me. I imagine him.
He sailed from Jerusalem up to there. I mean, I don't know because that's a desert. That's
That would be
dangerous
tough.
roads.
Exactly.
Let me touch briefly here on page 35 in the quotations. According to Scripture. This is well. I'll just read the first two. This is the most systematic discussion of other than this of these appearances that he's reporting, and he says, and this is all in the Corinthian correspondence. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And that's that 12 that, Mark, we were talking about a little bit ago. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. For I am the least of the apostles, and not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. And then we have this interesting statement that follows, where he is talking about this person in the third person, and some people argue he's making in the context of this, he's making a cryptic reference to himself, which is, if it is, then it's the closest thing to sort of this is the most detailed description of the experience itself. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. And in addition to being a very, very grammatically complicated, the way that this is written, it's there's that statement there for whatever he means by that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I guess, this next paragraph, or you think you would have a more vivid account, or even write about it more? I don't know. You'd see something like this that it wouldn't be so difficult to,
Yeah. You would want to talk about it, you would think, a lot of it.
About it itself.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It's pretty important. So you're saying I saw Christ, but that's all you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot to go on.
From my perspective, I mean, I come from a church where we believe in miracles and things like that, and sacred experiences that, from my perspective, that there are some things that, like some experiences that are so sacred and so personal, that they shouldn't be shared with other people. Because, I mean, there's the parable in the Gospels where the Lord says, casting your pearls before swine, don't do that. Yeah. And I think what he means by that is like a pig doesn't know the value of a pearl, of a gem. Mm-hmm. That he can't eat it, so it has no worth. But to someone like us, it's something that's very valuable, worth a lot of money. And so those experiences, I think, are like that it's like a pearl that we understand because we know the background of it, and we feel like the Lord is speaking directly to us. Mm-hmm. But if we were to share it, then it could be abused by other people and like discredited, or like, I mean, because you can't prove what Paul saw.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
And so there may be things that we don't understand because we're not in Paul's shoes where he would understand it.
Right.
And so the Lord says, don't say this is for you. Mm-hmm. And so, I believe that, we have experiences like that as well, to where, like, we shouldn't speak of it except in kind of oblique references like this, as God tells you to.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense because if you really were convinced that, if you really did see something, you wouldn't even need to go into the details. This is what happened. And that's all you need to say. So yeah, it's a good point.
I think our time is almost at hand. Any other final thoughts? All right. Well, let me close out. Thanks everybody for all your fantastic comments. That was great. We got through. And again, if anyone was wondering why I say this is very sensitive material, I hope we see why now. And so we had a good, respectful conversation, which, as we discussed back in discussion 1, is so important. So thanks very much for that. Just want to bring us back to the web page here for one last time. This is here for anyone. Again, like I said, throughout. People are going into family situations, neighborhood situations with friends where there are some real complicated issues, some of which are related to these sorts of things. Hopefully this can be a resource for you going forward. We have all the handouts are there. All the audio is there, so you can go back and listen to your own words of wisdom and the words of wisdom of other students. And I'll have the this session up there in the coming days. In terms of the future, this is ultimately. I think my view is that this is what's going to happen is what the RSOs want to have happen on campus, and if there is interest in continuing this to a next phase next year, I'm happy to work with people on that. But ultimately, this is I've come to respect over this last semester the influence that the RSOs have on campus in in either moving the student body to do things or not, and so it's really up to them going forward. So we will see what happens, and thank you all for coming.